My sister-in-law announced she was covering the entire $50,000 platinum package for my mother-in-law's 65th birthday party at the country club. When it was time to settle the bill, the event manager walked straight up to me and asked for payment. I just smirked. You people aren't nearly clever enough to trap me. My name is Catherine, but most people call me Kate. I'm in my mid-30s, and I work as the corporate controller for a major logistics company. My job is to look at numbers and see the things other people miss. For me, money has never been an emotional matter. It's about clarity, transparency, and accountability. You make your bed, you lie in it. That's the principle I've lived by for years. Perhaps that's why, in the eyes of my husband's family, I've always been seen as difficult, cold, and even unaccommodating. My husband, Michael, is the kind of man who always says he loves his wife, but the moment his mother or sister is involved, I'm expected to be the one to sacrifice for the greater good. That greater good, to be blunt, is usually just about maintaining their family's public image. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, is a woman who lives and breathes for appearances. In front of relatives and friends from her social clubs, she's the very picture of a graceful, well-to-do matriarch. But behind closed doors, she has one single crushing refrain she uses on me. A daughter-in-law needs to know how to keep the peace. My sister-in-law, Jessica, is, to put it plainly, the type of person who lives for the validation of strangers on the internet. She might not have two nickels to rub together, but her every word sounds like it's being delivered from a pedestal. She's addicted to showing off, to one-upmanship, and especially to never being outdone when it comes to appearances. My mother-in-law's 65th birthday party was held at the Oak Creek Country Club, with the main ballroom booked for over 200 guests. Relatives and friends from both sides of the family came, partly out of respect and partly out of sheer curiosity. For weeks, Jessica had been broadcasting the same line everywhere. "This party is all on me. I'm taking care of everything for Mom." That statement made my mother-in-law beam with pride for a solid month. On the day of the party, Eleanor wore a custom-made ruby red gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, and she glided through the ballroom as if this wasn't just a birthday party, but her own personal coronation. From the very start, she was raising her glass constantly, smiling at everyone she met, and saying, "That's my Jessica." She handled everything. I didn't have to lift a finger. Then she'd glance over at me. I knew that look all too well. It was a mix of smugness and victory, as if to say, "See? My daughter is the one who truly cares." Michael stood beside his mother and sister, smiling and nodding, playing the part of the successful, devoted son. He spoke louder than usual, his voice filled with a manufactured pride. To any outsider, they looked like a perfect, loving family, a testament to good breeding and filial piety. Only I, sitting at a corner table, was quietly observing. I didn't drink much, nor did I say much. I watched how Jessica moved from table to table, how she laughed, how she soaked up every compliment. I watched my mother-in-law's endless boasting and my husband's enthusiastic agreement, and I knew this party would not end peacefully, because 3 days prior, I had uncovered a few very strange details. Details that, when connected, formed a perfectly laid trap. As the guests finished their main course, the atmosphere began to settle. The boisterous laughter quieted, replaced by the clinking of glasses and the soft scrape of cutlery on porcelain. I had just set my water glass down when I saw the club's event manager emerge from his office. He was holding a leather-bound folio and walking directly towards me. Not towards Jessica, not towards Michael, towards me. He stopped in front of me, dipped his head politely, and said in a clear, professional voice, "Mrs. Davies, if you're ready, we can settle the remaining balance for today's event." The moment he finished speaking, my entire table went silent. The silence spread. The neighboring tables stopped their conversations. A few heads turned, then a few more, until it felt like someone had hit a mute button on the entire ballroom. My mother-in-law, who was holding a glass of champagne, froze mid-air. Michael whipped his head around to look at me, his eyes wide with shock for a split second. And Jessica, I saw her face drain of color, but in a flash, she composed herself, feigning a look of innocent confusion. I didn't speak right away. I took the invoice from the folio, glanced over it. The numbers were clear. It wasn't a surprise. It was exactly what I had predicted. I placed the invoice on the table and slowly stood up. I looked at the manager, then turned to look at each member of my husband's family. My gaze lingered longest on Jessica, then moved to Michael, and finally, to my mother-in-law. No one said a word. I let out a small, dry laugh, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Then, I spoke, each word clear and deliberate. Are you all really expecting me to pay the remaining $40,000 to save this pathetic charade? No one moved. No one interrupted. I looked them straight in the eyes, my voice turning to ice. You're not nearly clever enough to trap me. My words landed in the center of the silent ballroom, and the air seemed to contract. But if you were to ask me why, in that exact moment, I could stand so tall and speak with such conviction, I'll tell you the truth. It wasn't because I was braver than them. It was because I had seen this trap being built for the better part of a month. It all started on the day my mother-in-law turned 65. It was a normal weeknight dinner, but the atmosphere in our house was completely different. The moment Eleanor sat down, she began sighing dramatically, mentioning how this person's milestone birthday was so extravagant, and that person's children were so successful. Then she delivered the final, heavily emphasized line. A person only turns 65 once. If it's not done right, everyone will think this family is on its way down. I sat in silence, putting a piece of steak on my husband's plate, already sensing that something was about to happen. Sure enough, less than a minute later, Jessica, sitting across from me, suddenly placed her fork down with a loud clank. She lifted her chin as if waiting for her cue to step onto the stage. She looked directly at her mother, her voice ringing out, "Mom, for your birthday this year, let me handle it. 200 guests? Fine. A top-tier venue? Fine. I'll cover the whole package." The dinner table froze. Michael turned to his sister, his eyes lighting up as if he'd just heard something that made him immensely proud. As for my mother-in-law, it goes without saying. Her eyes practically glowed. I remember her expression vividly. It wasn't just joy. It was a kind of gloating satisfaction. She shot a quick glance at me, but it was enough for me to understand. In her mind, she was surely thinking, "See? My daughter is the one who takes care of things, not some tight-fisted daughter-in-law who clings to every penny." Michael immediately chimed in, affecting the tone of a wise, worldly man. Young people these days have to think big. If you nickel and dime everything, how will this family ever hold its head up high in the community? Hearing that, I knew he wasn't talking to his mother or sister. He was talking to me. I didn't argue. I'm not the type to fly off the handle at every provocation. I simply asked one very light question. "Have you calculated the total cost, Jess?" Jessica turned to me, a faint, dismissive smile on her lips. To an outsider, it might have looked like confidence, but I saw it for what it was. More bravado than substance, she answered nonchalantly. "Don't you worry about it, Kate. This is my thing. I've got it under control." I said nothing more, but a splinter of doubt had already lodged itself in my mind. Others might believe her, but I didn't. Jessica had no stable job. One minute she was an online influencer, the next a beauty consultant. Mostly, she posted glamorous photos of herself at expensive restaurants and boutiques. But if you asked about her actual income, she would never give a straight answer. Just a few months earlier, she had asked to borrow $1,000 from me, claiming she was a little short before a commission check came in, then pretended to forget when it was time to pay it back. A person like that suddenly offering to cover a $50,000 party? The words rang false in my ears. But my mother-in-law was different. She was at an age where social standing was more important than money. After that dinner, her entire attitude changed. She bragged to everyone she met. One day, I came home from work to find her in the living room, on the phone with a cousin, laughing so hard, her shoulders shook. My Jessica, she won't let me get involved at all, she said. Mom's birthday is my responsibility. I have to make you proud. As I walked past, she spoke even louder. Intentionally, for my benefit. A few days later, Jessica took her mother to tour the country club. The two of them took pictures from every angle, the ballroom, the table settings, the backdrop for photos, and posted them all over social media with vague captions like, "Prepping for a very special day for the most important person in my life." Relatives and friends flooded the comments. Some praised Eleanor for being so blessed. Others marveled at her daughter's devotion. My mother-in-law read every single comment with a giddy smile, carrying herself differently around the house, as if the party's glory had already been bestowed upon her before it even happened. Only I felt a growing chill. In my line of work, dealing with vendors and contractors year-round, I know one thing for certain. You don't secure a grand ballroom at a prestigious venue on a weekend with just a verbal promise. There had to be a substantial deposit, and it wouldn't be cheap. I didn't voice this, but I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Jessica would quickly change the subject whenever costs were mentioned. I noticed that every time Eleanor asked to add a new dish or upgrade the decor, Jessica would laugh loudly and say, "Mom, don't worry, I can handle it." People who truly have money don't talk about it so much. Only those who don't, but want to appear as if they do, need to speak so loudly. Then, one afternoon while I was at my office, I happened to overhear a colleague in the events industry mention that exact country club. It was just a passing comment, but it was enough to connect the dots of my suspicion. I later found out that Jessica had scrambled everywhere, borrowing a bit here from a high-interest lender, deferring a payment there, to scrape together the $10,000 deposit. That $10,000 was enough to hold the venue. Enough for her to continue playing the role of the doting daughter covering the whole affair. But the remaining $40,000? She didn't have it. The moment I knew that, I understood with absolute clarity that this was no longer a simple birthday celebration. It was a theatrical production of status, staged on a scale far beyond their means. And in productions like these, there always has to be someone behind the scenes left to clean up the mess. My in-laws, in their simple calculation, had decided that person would be me. With that thought, I began to watch every small change in the house more carefully. Sure enough, right after Jessica managed to secure the deposit, the entire family's attitude toward me shifted. My mother-in-law suddenly became less critical. Gone were the snide remarks like, "What's the point of making money if you're just going to hoard it?" Gone was the sour tone she used whenever I bought something for myself. In its place was a strange, saccharine sweetness that anyone who had lived with her long enough, as I had, would immediately recognize. It wasn't affection. It was preparation. One evening, I came home from work to find her in the kitchen, her voice as smooth as water. "Catherine, dear, I made a pot roast tonight. I know you work so hard. You should eat something hearty." It sounded thoughtful, but the fact that this woman, who for years had only ever pointed out my flaws, was suddenly so concerned right when Jessica was orchestrating a party far beyond her means, it didn't warm my heart. It sent a shiver down my spine. Michael was the same. Normally, he barely asked about my job. If I came home late, it was a perfunctory. "Working late again?" Huh. Working late again. If I was tired, at most he'd say, "Get some sleep." But during that period, he started asking more questions, and they were always aimed at the most sensitive topic. One night, as we were sitting in bed, he casually turned to me and said, "Business must be good at your company. Your quarterly bonus should be pretty hefty, huh?" I was drying my hair and paused for just a beat. I looked at my husband, smiling faintly to myself. After all these years together, I knew him inside and out. Michael only ever took an interest in my income when he already had a plan to spend. I didn't answer directly. Just said, "It's about average." He mumbled an, "Uh-huh," but the flicker of disappointment in his eyes confirmed my suspicions. A few days later, my mother-in-law started a new tactic, repeatedly praising me in front of others. One day, a great-aunt came to visit, and Eleanor said with a laugh, "Our Catherine is so good with numbers. She's used to dealing with figures and contracts." "Another day," she told a cousin. "She knows so many business people when it comes to payments. Invoices, wire transfers. No one is more skilled than her. If you weren't paying attention, you would think she was complimenting me, but I knew better." This was her way of planting a role in everyone's mind, so that when the time came, it would be the default assumption that I should be the one to handle it. That's what made it so insidious. It wasn't a direct demand, it was the slow weaving of a net. By the time you realize you're caught, you're surrounded by other people's eyes, their words, their expectations. My in-laws had always operated this way. They avoided direct confrontation if they could instead maneuver me into a position where I had no choice but to take on the burden. They knew I was a professional, someone who hated drama and public spectacles. In other words, they were betting that if they waited until the last possible second, I would bite the bullet and pay up just to maintain peace and order. But this time, they were wrong. I was on high alert. I didn't cause a scene or call anyone out. I just observed and probed, bit by bit. One afternoon, when it was just me and Jessica at home, she was in the living room painting her nails, her feet propped up, humming along to a song on her phone. I walked by and asked, as if it were an afterthought, "So, how are you coming along with the rest of the payment?" The moment I asked, her hand, holding the tiny polish brush, faltered ever so slightly. It was a minuscule hesitation. But for someone like me, accustomed to reading spreadsheets and facial expressions, it was a dead giveaway. She looked up, her brow furrowed for a second before she snapped, "I told you. I've got it. Why do you keep asking?" I stood there for a few more seconds, looking directly at her. If she had really had everything in order, she wouldn't have reacted as if I'd poked a sore spot. That kind of sudden anger was a clear sign. Behind her confident facade was a deep hole she was desperate to keep hidden. I didn't argue. I just gave a non-committal nod and went to my room. But from that moment on, a single thought solidified in my mind. Jessica was nowhere near having the money. And the less certain she was, the louder she had to talk. That night, my suspicions turned into cold, hard fact. I was working late in my home office, and around 11 p.m., I went to the balcony to bring in some clothes I'd left out to dry. I heard Michael's voice from the hallway. He was on the phone, speaking in a hushed tone, clearly not wanting to be overheard. I slowed my steps instinctively and stood just behind our bedroom door. At first, I only caught snippets like, "Yeah, I know. Don't panic." Then his voice became a little clearer, and he said just one sentence that made my blood run cold. "Just get through the party. When the bill comes, if you're short, I'll talk to Kate." I stood frozen behind the door. I didn't need to hear another word. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. Not his mother, not a friend. It could only be Jessica. The feeling at that moment is hard to describe. It wasn't complete surprise, because I had already suspected it. But when a suspicion is confirmed by your own husband's words, it still hurts in a unique way. My heart didn't race. Instead, a chill settled deep within me. I understood everything. They had no intention of following through on their promises. All they needed was for the party to be grand enough, glamorous enough, to give Eleanor her moment in the sun. The remaining bill? They planned to push it on to me at the very last minute. I heard Michael continue, his voice laced with the irritation of someone trying to placate a foolish but troublesome child. "Yeah, I know. But don't say anything to Mom right now. The more drama, the messier it gets. On the day, just let it play out. When it's time to pay, in front of all those people, Kate won't dare let Mom be humiliated." That sentence was like a knife, slicing through whatever was left of my feelings. So that's what I was in my husband's eyes. Not a wife, but a predictable reaction. A person who would automatically pay up simply to avoid public embarrassment. He never thought to ask me, never thought to respect me. He was simply calculating how to corner me, to force me to do what he wanted. I backed away, stepping silently back into my room and sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands ice cold. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking clock, my mind unnervingly clear. Over the years, I had been maneuvered by my in-laws into situations where I had to endure, to compromise, to pay, to keep the peace. But this was different. This was a calculated trap. There was a planner, a collaborator, and a pre-packaged moral justification designed to bind me. In that moment, I stopped seeing this as a simple matter of money. $40,000, $50,000, whatever the amount, it was just a number. What chilled me to the bone was that they saw me as a tool to be used. They thought that by leveraging a crowd and dangling the words, "Mom will be humiliated," I would obediently open my wallet. They thought that to protect my in-laws' public image, I would swallow my pride and become the sacrificial lamb. I sat in the darkness for a long time, and then I just started to laugh to myself. It wasn't a sad laugh anymore. It was a cold one, because I knew, with absolute certainty, one thing. If I didn't prepare, they would use both the crowd and a sense of duty to pin me to the wall. But if I prepared thoroughly enough, the very trap they had set would snap back and ensnare them instead. After I finished laughing, I felt strangely calm. Perhaps it's because when you see the true face of a trap, you're no longer scared. You just start calculating how to dismantle it cleanly, and even better, how to make the trappers get tangled in their own ropes. The next morning, I went to work as usual. I greeted my mother-in-law with just enough politeness. I ate breakfast in silence. I let Michael continue his act as the perfect husband and son, as if nothing had happened. I knew that at this stage, I couldn't let on that I knew. One wrong move and they would change their strategy, and I would lose my advantage. At the office, the first thing I did wasn't to check my email or review reports. It was to lock my office door, lower the blinds, and search through my contacts. In my phone, I had the number for Susan Miller, the corporate events manager at the very country club where Jessica had booked the party. My company had hosted 2 client appreciation events there in the past. Susan and I had a good working relationship, not close friends, but professional enough that I could ask a question without it seeming out of place. I dialed her number. She answered quickly, her voice as cheerful and efficient as ever. "Kate, it's been a while. How can I help you?" I made some small talk, then got straight to the point. I told her my in-laws were having an event at her venue, and I just wanted to touch base to make sure everything was in order, as there had been some back-and-forth discussions at home. I said I was worried about details getting lost in translation. Susan didn't suspect a thing. She pulled up the event file right then and there. After a few seconds, she said, "Ah, yes, the 65th birthday party for this weekend. 200 guests. Contract is under the name Jessica Davies. The $10,000 deposit was also transferred from her account. Everything looks to be in order, Kate." Hearing that, I leaned back in my chair. I wasn't surprised, but I felt a small sense of relief. At least on paper, the responsible party was Jessica. That meant, legally, I was not obligated to pay. What I had feared from the start wasn't the contract itself, but the underhanded dealings happening behind it. And just as I suspected, Susan's next sentence made me sit bolt upright. She said, laughing casually, "Oh, and Kate, at first I thought Jessica was handling everything herself, but when she came in to finalize the menu, she pulled me aside and said one thing. She told me that on the day of the event, if there were any unexpected charges or if anything needed to be settled quickly, I should speak directly with you, her sister-in-law, since you're the one who really handles the family's finances." I was silent for a few seconds, long enough for Susan on the other end to sense that something was wrong. She asked quietly, "Uh-oh, is there a problem?" I didn't answer immediately. I just felt a chill spread through me, but it was no longer the chill of surprise. It was the cold confirmation of something truly dirty. So that was their plan. On paper, Jessica's name was on everything, all for show. So she could brag to the relatives that she was footing the bill. But in practice, she had already created a detour, secretly pointing the venue's staff in my direction. If there were extra costs, if they were short on money, if a signature was needed urgently to smooth things over during the party, they wouldn't look for Jessica, they would look for me. Jessica might not be smart in a truly capable way, but she was cunning in the way of people who live by their wits and words. She knew exactly what to say to make me the backup plan without ever asking for my permission. I took a slow breath and then said to Susan, my voice perfectly normal, "No, not at all, Susan. I just like to have everything clear. On the day of the event, if there are any outstanding payments, please make sure you direct them to the person who signed the contract." First, she hesitated. "You mean, to Jessica?" I replied succinctly. "Yes. Whoever took responsibility should be held responsible. I just don't want things to get awkward for your staff." Susan was quiet for a moment. Then, likely understanding at least a part of the situation, her voice dropped. "Okay, I get it. Don't worry, Kate. I'll instruct my team to follow standard procedure." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in my office for a long time. I wasn't angry, not in a hot-headed way. At that point, I just found it all darkly amusing. Amusing to see Jessica's hollow pride, amusing to see how smoothly Michael collaborated with his sister, as if deceiving his wife was the most natural thing in the world. And amusing to see my in-laws, who were always talking about family and loyalty, but who treated me like a walking wallet the moment money was involved. Meanwhile, at home, things were becoming more and more blatant. My mother-in-law was on a high, ecstatic. She was constantly on the phone with relatives, friends, and even old rivals she liked to compete with. One time, I walked through the living room and heard her booming into the phone. "This family is so united. From start to finish, no one else had to lift a finger." My Jessica said, "Mom, you just sit back and enjoy." I had to walk quickly into the kitchen because if I had stayed another second, I feared I would have burst out laughing right in front of her. United? No one had to lift a finger? The more she boasted, the fewer escape routes Jessica had. And the fewer escape routes she had, the more desperately they would try to pull me in to save the day. I started to see things from a different perspective. In the past, whenever my in-laws pressured me into yielding, I used to think it was easier to just let it go. But this time, I understood something more profound. For people like my mother-in-law and Jessica, their obsession with appearances wasn't just a bad habit. It was an addiction. They were willing to spend far beyond their means just to receive a few words of admiration. And like any addict, they would always need a scapegoat to pay the price for their high. Michael continued to play the role of the reasonable husband, a role I had seen far too many times. He no longer directly mentioned my quarterly bonus. Instead, he started using a softer, more roundabout approach. One evening, as I was folding laundry, he was leaning against the headboard and said in a very gentle voice, "It's a once-in-a-lifetime party for Mom, Kate. I know you haven't been happy lately, but let's not make things too tense. Whatever happens, let's try to be graceful about it." On the surface, it sounded like a husband advising his wife to keep the peace. But I knew better. It wasn't advice. It was psychological groundwork. He was subtly reminding me that if something went wrong on the day of the party, I should be graceful and let it pass. And in his family's vocabulary, letting it pass had only ever meant one thing. I had to pay up and swallow my anger. I turned to look at my husband and asked calmly, "What are you afraid I'll make a scene about, Mike?" He was visibly startled, but only for a second. Then he chuckled. "I'm just speaking generally. Why are you so sensitive?" I didn't say anything more. I just finished folding the shirt in my hands, placed it in the drawer, and turned off the light. On the outside, I remained as silent as ever. I let them think I was just being moody, that I didn't know anything, and that at the last minute, I would be pushed in the direction they wanted. But only I knew that ever since that call with Susan, I had established a very clear principle in my mind. It was a short principle, but it was enough to keep me from softening my resolve ever again. Whoever wants the glory pays the price. From that night on, I didn't say another word to anyone about money or the party. I continued to go to work on time, ate dinner with the family when I was home, and listened to my mother-in-law's boasting and Michael's empty talk as if nothing was wrong. But beneath that calm exterior, I was watching with perfect clarity as they walked themselves deeper and deeper into the hole they were digging. As the day of the party drew closer, Jessica's spending became more outrageous. Initially, it was just the standard package for 200 guests. Then she upgraded to a more expensive menu, saying it would be embarrassing to serve her mother's guests mediocre food. Then she insisted on adding a giant LED backdrop, a dessert bar, a photo booth with instant prints for guests, and even upgraded the wine at every table from the house selection to a pricier label just because it looked better. Each time, my mother-in-law didn't just fail to stop her. She encouraged her. She would say in a tone that was half pride, half excitement, "I only do this once in my life. If you're going to do it right. People should walk in and be impressed." Hearing her, I just felt a coldness inside me. People are usually afraid of being poor, but for my mother-in-law, her greatest fear wasn't a lack of money, but losing out on a single glance of admiration from others. One day, she sat in the living room with her phone, bragging to one person, inviting another. I walked by and heard her cackle. My Jessica is so meticulous. From the food to the decorations, she upgraded everything. She said a party for her mother couldn't be anything less than perfect. Just from that sentence alone, I knew the total cost had surely ballooned far beyond the initial estimate. With every addition, the hole beneath them grew deeper. The afternoon before the party, I was in my home office reviewing a report when Michael walked in. He didn't sit down right away, but leaned against the doorframe, a hesitant look on his face as if he had something difficult to say. I looked up at him without a word. Finally, he spoke. "For the party tomorrow, remember to bring your credit cards and some cash, just in case. You never know if something comes up and we need to handle it." Hearing that, I put my pen down very slowly. His words sounded casual, but they were the most blatant admission yet. I looked at my husband, my voice even. "Am I going to Mom's birthday party? Or am I going to bail out your family's vanity project?" Michael flinched, then scowled. "I'm just saying to be prepared. We're family. We help each other out. Why do you have to make everything so dramatic?" I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "We're family," I repeated slowly. "When you need my money, we're family. But when your mother is belittling me, when your sister treats me like a walking ATM, why doesn't anyone remember that I'm family then?" Michael's face contorted with irritation, his voice rising. "You always have to dig up old issues. It's such a small thing, and you keep going on and on about it." I didn't argue further. When you poke some people in their most hidden, shameful spots, they automatically get angry to drown out the truth. I had seen it too many times with his family. I just gave a slight nod and said, "Fine. I'll be there tomorrow." My voice was so calm that even Michael couldn't guess what I was really thinking. The next morning, from the moment I opened my eyes, I knew the day would not be a peaceful one. The atmosphere in the house was completely different. My mother-in-law was up at dawn, getting her hair and makeup done, sitting in front of the mirror since 7 a.m., her face radiant, as if she were preparing for her own wedding. Jessica was rushing around with her phone glued to her ear, one moment calling the venue, the next the photographer, then the MC, her voice loud and full of excitement. She looked so busy. Anyone would have thought she had everything under control, only I was strangely composed. I chose a simple, dark-colored dress, elegant but not flashy. I did my makeup minimally, tied my hair back, and picked up my purse as I normally would. No one knew that in my purse that day, there were none of the credit cards my in-laws were counting on. The only things I brought with me were a clear head and a memory sharp enough not to let myself be cast in the role of someone else's debt payer. On the way out to the car, my mother-in-law turned and called after me. "There will be a lot of people today, Catherine. Remember to behave appropriately. We don't want anyone thinking this family's daughter-in-law lacks grace." I turned back and smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Eleanor. I know exactly who needs to be on their best behavior today." My words made her pause for a moment, but she just frowned and didn't press further. When we arrived at the country club, everything was just as I had expected, perhaps even more ostentatious than I'd imagined. The entrance hall and the ballroom were lavishly decorated, with a giant backdrop in the center bearing the words, "Happy 65th birthday, Eleanor," next to a large, smiling portrait of her. Jessica moved through the room like she owned the place, a constant smile on her face, waving to everyone. As guests arrived, she would greet them warmly. "Yes, I'm handling everything for Mom today." Hearing this, Eleanor's face bloomed like a flower, and Michael, standing beside her, couldn't hide his pride. I took a seat at my table early on, observing everything without saying much. I noticed that while Jessica's laugh was loud, as the evening wore on, her eyes started darting around more frequently. An outsider wouldn't notice, but to me, it was the clear sign of someone waiting for a crisis they knew they couldn't handle. Michael was the same. He was greeting guests and making conversation. But every so often, he would cast a quick, nervous glance towards the front desk and the area where the managers stood. The party progressed, guests ate and drank their fill, and a chorus of praise and well wishes filled the air. My mother-in-law was having the time of her life, her cheeks flushed with wine and pure joy. Jessica played the role of the devoted daughter to perfection. If you didn't know any better, you would have applauded her. And then, at that precise moment, just as dessert was being served and the chatter began to die down, the event manager walked out with his folio. He scanned the room, paused for a few seconds, and then headed directly for my table. I saw it clearly from across the room. The moment Jessica saw him, her face went pale. Michael's hand froze in midair. The manager stopped in front of me, dipped his head politely, and said in a clear, professional voice, "Mrs. Davies, if you're ready, we can settle the remaining balance for today's event." I slowly looked up. The entire ballroom had started to turn and stare. Eleanor's hand was frozen. Jessica was feigning confusion. Michael was staring at me, his eyes pleading, demanding that I understand what I was supposed to do. I took the invoice, glanced at it, and placed it on the table. Then, I slowly stood up, looking at each of their faces, my husband's family. I let the silence in the ballroom deepen, and then I spoke, my voice clear enough for every word to be heard. "Are you all really expecting me to pay the remaining $40,000 to save this pathetic charade? You're not nearly clever enough to trap me." The atmosphere in the ballroom didn't just break, it shattered. But strangely, the more eyes that turned to me, the clearer my head became. Perhaps it was because I had been anticipating this very moment for days. I was no longer surprised, no longer panicking, and certainly no longer in the habit of swallowing my grievances as I had so many times before. I picked up the invoice again, turning the pages slowly. The rustle of the paper was loud in the dead silence of the room. I read aloud, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Total, $52,450. Deposit paid, $10,000. Remaining balance, $42,450. Is that correct? The event manager, standing before me, was visibly flustered, but still nodded. "Yes, that's correct, ma'am." I put the invoice down and turned to look directly at Jessica. She was standing less than 10 feet away, her face rigid, though she was still trying to force a smile. I asked, my voice completely normal, so normal that anyone could tell I was giving her one last chance to save herself. "You said you were covering the entire package, Jess. So go ahead and settle the rest of this." Jessica froze for several seconds. I saw her swallow hard. But just a few moments later, true to form, for someone who lived by her words. She managed a weak laugh. She turned to the people at the next table as if to gather courage, then said loudly, "Oh, come on, Kate. You're the one who worked with the club on the details. Why don't you pay it first, and I'll transfer you the money later?" I burst out laughing. Not a joyful laugh, but the kind of dry, humorless sound that made the people nearby start exchanging uneasy glances. I looked up at her. "Worked with the club? What on earth are you talking about?" The moment I asked, the aunts and uncles at the nearby tables started whispering. Some frowned, while others sat up straighter, eager to hear every word. Michael, seeing the situation veering wildly off his intended course, quickly intervened. He strode over, and though he spoke in a low voice, the clenched teeth and tense tone betrayed his desperation. "Kate, don't make a scene. We have guests." I turned to look at my husband. This man, even at a time like this, was only concerned about losing face. I asked him, not bothering to lower my voice. "You're afraid of losing face? Then tell your sister to pay the bill. I never agreed to cover this." That statement was like an invisible slap across the ballroom. My mother-in-law, sitting at the main table, her hand still holding a glass, saw her expression change completely. She shot up from her chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. Though she was visibly shaken, she tried to maintain her matriarchal composure in front of the relatives. She looked at me, her voice tight. "Catherine, that's enough. This is a family matter. Pay it for now, and we'll sort it out at home." "Irma, today is my special day." I looked at her. If this had been a few years ago, her plea about her special day would have been enough to make me grit my teeth and pull out my credit card. But not that day. That day, all I could see was that her so-called special day was built on a foundation of deceit and calculation by her own son and daughter. I cut her off as soon as she finished speaking. "No, I'm not paying. The person who made the promise is the person who pays." For the first time in all my years as a daughter-in-law, I had spoken to her so bluntly, and right in front of all our relatives. I could hear the coldness in my own voice. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was the sound of someone who was too exhausted to sugarcoat the truth for anyone anymore. Immediately after that, a wave of whispers rippled through the tables. People nearby started asking each other in low voices. One aunt even leaned over to her neighbor and said, without bothering to cover her mouth, "Wait, so who was supposed to be paying?" An uncle frowned, staring intently at Jessica. The ballroom that had been so festive just moments before was now filled with a tense, awkward silence, punctuated only by whispers. It was then that Jessica's face truly turned pale. Not the feigned paleness from before, but a genuine, deathly white. Her eyes darted from her mother to her brother, then to me. I knew she was panicking because the script had gone completely off track. She had assumed that the moment the manager approached me in front of everyone, I would understand my role and pay up to save the family's image. She never imagined I would dare to stand up and call her out so publicly. As for Michael, he had lost all of his initial composure. The veins on his temples were throbbing, his lips were pressed into a thin line, and his eyes kept flicking between me, the manager, and the tables of relatives. I knew exactly what he was feeling. He wasn't worried about me or his mother. He was terrified that their carefully constructed play was falling apart in front of a live audience. The event manager stood there, trapped. He looked at me, then at Jessica, as if waiting for someone to finally take responsibility. I remained standing by the table, one hand resting on the invoice, feeling a sense of calm that surprised even me. I didn't say anything more. I had said enough. The next move wasn't mine to make. It was up to the people who had so loudly claimed the spotlight. My mother-in-law looked from me to Jessica, and then to Michael. For the first time, I saw a strange new emotion flicker in her eyes. It wasn't quite enlightenment, but it certainly wasn't the proud glow she'd had at the beginning of the evening. And Jessica, her lips began to tremble. She tried to swallow, tried to smile, but the more she tried, the more her face betrayed her utter panic. And in that moment, as the entire room began to realize that something was terribly wrong, I knew one thing: the image. The social standing that my in-laws had so painstakingly built up for weeks had finally begun to crack. The instant Jessica saw the tide of opinion turning, she changed her tactic. No longer frozen in place, she suddenly clutched her chest, her eyes blinking rapidly as if she were about to burst into tears. Then, in the classic move of someone who is wrong but desperate to play the victim, she turned to me, her voice shrill in the quiet room. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? You're trying to ruin Mom's birthday." As soon as she said that, a few of the older relatives at the main table turned to look at me with disapproval. One frowned, another sighed, and a few more made their displeasure clear. I knew that reaction well. To outsiders who didn't know the whole story, they saw only one thing. On her mother-in-law's special day, the daughter-in-law was refusing to pay, causing a scene. That alone was enough to make them think I was being unreasonable. An aunt on my mother-in-law's side leaned over and said in a low but audible voice, "Whatever it is, you should settle it at home. Making a scene in front of everyone like this is just not right." Another uncle shook his head with a look of weary disgust. Jessica, seeing a few sympathetic glances, was immediately emboldened. She bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes, and continued in a choked, aggrieved voice, "I worked so hard for Mom for weeks, and now, at the final moment, you stand up and say things like that. How do you want our family to look in front of everyone?" I almost laughed out loud. Truly, the more cornered she was, the better her acting became. But this time, I didn't cut her off. I stood there silently, letting her speak, letting the disapproving glares from around the room intensify. I understood perfectly. To unmask an actor, you have to let them overplay their part. I waited until she had finished. Then, I slowly reached down, picked up my phone, and opened a note I had prepared earlier. I didn't turn to argue with her, nor did I engage with the relatives. I walked directly to the event manager, held my phone out for him to see, and said clearly and deliberately, "Could you please read this for everyone? Who is the signatory on the contract?" The manager was taken aback. He clearly hadn't expected me to escalate things this way. He glanced at Jessica, then at my mother-in-law, then back at me. His awkward posture showed he knew he was in the middle of a messy family drama, but with dozens of eyes fixed on him, he couldn't avoid it. Finally, he cleared his throat and said slowly, "The event contract is signed under the name Miss Jessica Davies. The initial $10,000 deposit was also transferred from her account." The moment he finished, a collective gasp went through the nearby tables. It wasn't loud, but it was audible enough for the entire room. A few people who had been glaring at me moments before now turned to stare at Jessica. One great-aunt muttered, "Wait a minute. Then what was all that about the daughter-in-law being responsible?" An uncle near the door propped his elbows on the table, looking at Jessica as if he had just figured something out. I didn't let the buzz die down. I took another step forward, positioning myself in the aisle where everyone could see me clearly. I held up my phone a little higher, my voice sharp. "And there's this. Your private note to the club's staff. It says, if there are any unexpected charges or if the final payment needs to be settled urgently, please find my sister-in-law, as she controls the family's finances. Is that correct?" Jessica's already pale face went ashen. It wasn't the pallor of embarrassment anymore. It was the color of true fear. Her lips moved several times before she managed to stammer out, I just said that. For convenience." I cut her off before she could spin another lie. "No, you didn't say it for convenience. You said it so that when you came up short, they would come and pressure me." Every word I spoke was slow and clear. No shouting, no crying, no bitterness. But it was that very calmness that allowed everyone in the room to hear the filthiness of the whole affair. From the tables, people started to lean back in their chairs, as if they had just witnessed a dramatic plot twist. An aunt on my father-in-law's side curled her lip in disdain at Jessica and shook her head. Others said nothing, but their expressions had changed completely. From curiosity and disapproval of me, they had moved to suspicion and scrutiny of the host's own daughter. At that moment, Michael couldn't take it anymore. He strode forward, his face flushed, and grabbed my wrist. His grip was painfully tight, not from strength, but from all the rage and panic that had been building up. He hissed through clenched teeth. "Shut up, Kate. We'll talk about this at home." I turned to look at my husband for a split second, but in that instant, I saw his true face. He was no longer the reasonable husband, no longer the devoted son worried about his mother. He was just a cornered man whose plan had been foiled, desperately trying to silence me. I yanked my arm free from his grasp, so forcefully that he stumbled back. Then I looked him straight in the eye and said, loud enough for everyone who had just been pitying his sister to hear clearly, "No, we're settling this right now." I turned slowly, looking from my mother-in-law to Jessica, and to all the faces staring at me from around the ballroom. Then I said something that, in all my years of marriage, no one would have ever imagined I would dare to say in public. I am not this family's ATM. The ballroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence. No more clinking spoons, no more shifting chairs, no more whispers. The silence was so thick I could hear my own breathing. My mother-in-law stood frozen, her hand clutching a napkin, trembling. Jessica was rooted to the spot, her eyes wide and vacant. And Michael, he looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. In that instant, I knew I had crossed the final line. I was no longer the silent daughter-in-law. And once that silence was broken, no one in my husband's family could ever force it back into place again. The moment my words landed, Jessica looked as if the air had been squeezed from her lungs. She stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom. Her shoulders began to shake, and then she suddenly covered her face and burst into sobs. But I could tell immediately it wasn't the complete breakdown of someone who genuinely felt remorse. It was a performance. Part real panic, part calculated act, designed to release her own tension and garner sympathy. She choked out between sobs. I just wanted to do something nice for Mom. I never thought it would turn out like this. I can't believe you would escalate things this way." Hearing that, a few of the older relatives near the front of the room began to speak up, but their tone of admonishment was no longer as firm as before. A great-aunt on Eleanor's side sighed. "Well, whatever the issue, it should be discussed at home. This is a public place." Another uncle frowned, looking back and forth between us, and added, "Jessica was clearly in the wrong, but at this point you should try to help each other out." I heard it all but didn't respond right away. I just looked at Jessica, who was still crying, and then, at the wavering expressions around the room. I knew this was the moment when it would be easiest to give in. People are often like that. The sight of tears makes them forget the actions that caused them. But not me. I hadn't forgotten how she had meticulously planned to shift the bill to me, and I certainly hadn't forgotten Michael's voice on the balcony. "When the bill comes, if you're short, I'll talk to Kate." Just then, Michael stepped forward, his face beet red, his chest heaving. He declared loudly to the entire room, as if trying to reclaim his role as the man in charge. "Fine, I'll pay it. Are you happy now, Kate?" The room buzzed with another wave of whispers. A few people looked at him as if they were relieved to finally see a man of the house step up. But I looked directly at my husband, my expression chillingly calm. I asked slowly, each word distinct. "With what money, Michael? Yours or mine?" The question landed right as he was trying to salvage his pride, and it hit him like a physical blow. His face went rigid. The relatives around us immediately started exchanging glances. An aunt at a table near the stage muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Wait, so who's been paying for things all this time?" I didn't give Michael a chance to deflect or offer a vague answer. I took half a step closer, my eyes still locked on his. "For years, Michael. The mortgage, the car payments, Mom's medical bills, who paid for them? Tell me." The air in the ballroom grew thick. I didn't need to shout or list every single grievance. Those few questions were enough, because it was the truth. The condo we lived in, the monthly payments, The times Eleanor had been in the hospital, and all the major household expenses, the vast majority of it had come from my salary. Michael wasn't incapable of earning money, but his money always seemed to disappear. Sometimes it was an investment with a friend. Other times it was for a business expense, or to help Jessica out a little. The one who always had to bear the financial brunt, the one who kept their household from collapsing, was me. Michael opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. I saw the muscle in his jaw clench, his eyes darting away. For the first time in years, he couldn't come up with a single retort in front of a crowd, not because he had any sense of shame, but because the truth was too obvious. To argue would only further expose who he was financially dependent on. I turned my head to look at my mother-in-law. Eleanor was still standing, but her posture was no longer as upright as it had been. Her hand gripped her clutch tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her expression had changed. It was no longer just anger directed at me. There was something else wavering in her eyes. It was the look of someone being forced to confront a truth they had willfully ignored for years. She looked at Michael for a long time, then back at me. I knew that, at least in that moment. She was beginning to ask herself a question she had never considered before. Was it possible that the daughter-in-law she had always criticized for being calculating was, in fact, the one holding their entire family up? But I didn't stop there. The person who deserved to be called out wasn't just my husband. I turned to Jessica. She was still crying, but her sobs were quieter now. Perhaps even she realized that more tears wouldn't save her. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice cold and concise. You wanted to throw a big party to get praise, Jess. That's fine, but you have to pay for it yourself. No one is going to bail you out forever. Jessica's head snapped up. Her eyes were no longer filled with the feigned hurt of a victim, but with genuine, venomous anger. The anger of someone who was used to using tears to get her way, and for the first time was finding her opponent unmoved. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Even she knew that, at this point, saying anything more would only bring her more shame. From the nearby tables, the direction of the stairs had completely shifted. A moment ago, the pressure had been on me, as if I were the one who didn't know how to behave on my mother-in-law's special day. But now, it was different. People had heard enough to understand that this wasn't just a birthday party. It was a spectacle of vanity that had gone too far. And behind that spectacle was a scheme to push the bill onto someone else. An aunt who had earlier advised me to take it home was now looking at Jessica and shaking her head. An uncle at the next table rested his chin on his hand, looking at Michael with undisguised disappointment. The room no longer saw me as the party crasher. They were finally looking at the real source of the problem, at Jessica, at Michael, at the ugly face of pride and calculation that was being stripped bare in front of everyone. And for the first time in my many years as a daughter-in-law, I didn't feel alone. Because I knew that from that moment on, the tables had turned, and the people who thought they could use a crowd to force me to bow my head were now the ones being stared at. Seeing the collective gaze of the room shift entirely toward her, Jessica stopped crying aloud. She stood there, tears still streaming down her face, but her expression was frozen, like someone desperately trying to calculate an escape route that no longer existed. Michael was grinding his teeth, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. My mother-in-law still hadn't sat down, but her entire demeanor had changed. The proud, beaming glow from earlier was gone, replaced by the bewildered look of someone watching the beautiful curtain she'd hung go up in flames in front of a full house. I knew that if I stopped here, my in-laws could still find a way to spin this. They could claim it was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a simple family argument that got out of hand. No, I had tolerated them for too long to know that if you're going to expose a lie, you have to pull it out by the roots. Otherwise, in a few days, I would be the one blamed for making a mountain out of a molehill. I looked directly at Jessica and said, my voice not loud but carrying clearly across the room, "That $10,000 deposit, you got it from a high-interest lender, didn't you?" The moment I said it, Jessica flinched as if she'd been physically struck. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell open, but she couldn't speak. The reaction was so instantaneous that only someone standing close would have noticed its full impact. But for me, it was more than enough. If it wasn't true, she would have denied it immediately. Only someone hit with the precise truth they were hiding would freeze like that. The nearby tables erupted in a fresh wave of whispers. An uncle from the family's side leaned forward intently. An aunt holding a glass of water paused mid-sip. I didn't give Jessica time to recover. I continued, each word landing slowly and deliberately. 3 days ago, the lender called my number by mistake. Did you think I wouldn't find out? By then, the murmuring had grown louder. No longer the polite, restrained whispers from before. Someone blurted out, "Good Lord, a payday loan?" Another person turned to look at my mother-in-law with an expression of mingled curiosity and pity. The social standing she had cherished for the entire evening was now crumbling, piece by piece, with every word I spoke. Jessica stammered, You're making that up! Who called you?" But her voice had lost all its conviction. The more she denied it, the more her face betrayed her panic. I looked at her without smiling, without raising my voice. I just spoke evenly. If I'm making it up, why is your face so pale? If I'm lying, why haven't you been able to look me in the eye this entire time? She bit her lip, her hands twisting together. I knew she was gearing up for another crying jag, but this time, no one was going to be so easily swayed, because once the words high-interest lender were out in the open, the story was no longer about a simple financial shortfall. It had become a tale of leveraging debt to fund a vanity project, with the whole family on the line. I turned to my mother-in-law. Eleanor stood not far from me, but in just a few minutes, she seemed to have aged years. I looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Eleanor, do you think your daughter is being a devoted child? Or is she gambling with your reputation?" The question stopped her cold. Her lips moved, but for the first time since the whole mess started, she couldn't say a single word in her daughter's defense. Perhaps even she had never imagined that behind all the boasting and promises of "I'll take care of it, Mom," was money from a loan shark. And that kind of debt wasn't a game. It was something people only turned to when they were desperate or reckless. Michael's face was flushed. I couldn't tell if he was ashamed of being exposed in front of the relatives or furious that I had dug so deep, but he still tried to use his masculine authority to shut the conversation down. "That's enough. Let's just pay the bill and go home to talk about this." I whipped my head around to face my husband. That line, "Go home to talk about this," I had heard it too many times. Whenever they were in the wrong in public, once we were home, I was always the one pressured to be quiet, to endure, to just let it go. Not this time. I didn't answer him. I turned to the event manager, my voice so firm that he instinctively straightened his posture. "Please proceed according to the contract. The person who signed is the person who pays." The manager swallowed hard and gave a slight nod. I knew that with those words, I had just cut off Jessica's last possible escape route. From now on, this wasn't about the sister-in-law who handles the family finances. This was about a contract. Whosever name was on it was responsible. It was that simple. Then I turned back and looked at them all one last time, from Jessica to Michael, to my mother-in-law, and even to the faces of the relatives frozen at their tables. I said one more thing. A sentence that, in all my years of marriage, I had never had the chance to say so clearly. "I am not saving this fake image for you today." No one replied. Jessica stood motionless, tears still falling, but her victim act had lost all its power. I looked around the room and knew it. No one was speaking up for her anymore. No one was turning to scold me for not keeping the peace. The people who had earlier advised me to be quiet were now either sitting in silence, shaking their heads, or exchanging glances that said they finally understood the whole story. My mother-in-law slowly sank back into her chair. She wasn't crying, but her hands trembled visibly. Michael stood as if he had been turned to stone, and Jessica bowed her head, no longer having the courage to play any more roles. And I knew, in that very moment, that the grand birthday spectacle they had built with boasts, with borrowed money, and with a calculated plot aimed at me, had well and truly collapsed. That carefully constructed charade of a birthday party didn't collapse with a single, loud crash. Instead, it disintegrated piece by piece, right in front of everyone. First came the stunned silence. Then the whispers grew into audible chatter. There were exchanged glances, heads shaking in disapproval, and the pitying smirks people try to hide but never quite manage. It was the very thing my mother-in-law feared most in life, not poverty, not losing money, but having the world see her family for what it truly was. The event manager waited a few more minutes before he had to, once again, bring up the matter of the payment. At that, Jessica slumped into her chair, her head bowed, as if all the bones had been removed from her body. She couldn't utter another word. The image of the devoted, generous daughter she had cultivated for a month had died on the very day she intended for it to shine brightest. Michael stood in the middle of the ballroom, his face alternating between red and pale. I could see the internal struggle in his eyes. On one side was his male ego, which had been trampled in public. On the other was a $40,000 hole gaping open before him. Finally, after nearly 10 minutes of chaos, he pulled out his phone and walked to a quiet corner near the reception desk to make a call. I didn't need to hear to know what he was doing. He was borrowing money from a friend. It was probably the most humiliating phone call of his life. The man who always acted so righteous, who prized appearances, who played the part of the family pillar, was now huddled in a corner, swallowing his pride to beg for a loan to cover a party his sister had taken false credit for. When he returned, his face was ashen, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line, his collar slightly askew. I knew at a glance that he had lost both money and face, and for him, the latter was probably the more painful blow. Once the manager received confirmation of the wire transfer, the atmosphere in the ballroom was beyond saving. Guests began to rise and leave, but not with the cheerful congratulations from before. Some walked past my mother-in-law's table with a perfunctory nod. Others waited until they were in the hallway to start whispering animatedly. Some looked at Jessica with pity, while others stared directly at my mother-in-law with a mockery they didn't bother to conceal. I stood there, saying nothing more. I didn't feel the sense of triumph an outsider might expect. Honestly, by that point, I just felt tired of having to watch a family expose all its ugliest parts for the world to see. But mixed with that fatigue was a strange sensation of release, as if a heavy stone that had been sitting on my chest for years had finally, at least partially, been lifted. My mother-in-law had lost all of the evening's ebullience. She sat motionless in her chair for a long time, staring blankly at the tabletop where half-empty glasses lay scattered. Her lipstick was still perfect, her gown still beautiful, her hair still immaculate. But she looked completely hollowed out. It was the first time I had ever seen on her face an expression that could be described as shame. The drive home from the country club was short, but suffocatingly long. No one spoke. Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly it looked like he wanted to crush it. Jessica sat in the back, her eyes swollen, occasionally letting out a small, stifled sob. My mother-in-law sat next to me, her body rigid, staring out the window. There were no more comments about how the evening was ruined, or how I had overreacted, or that we would talk about it at home. There was only a silence as heavy as lead. I, too, was silent. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because I knew it wasn't over. The real storm was still waiting. In a ballroom full of people, they had to swallow their humiliation. Back home, behind closed doors, their true natures would be unleashed, and I was right. The moment we stepped into the living room, Michael threw his keys onto the glass coffee table with a loud, jarring clatter. He whipped around to face me, his voice thick with rage. "What you did tonight was completely out of line." I set my purse down on a chair and turned to face my husband. Strangely, I no longer felt intimidated by his anger. Perhaps after everything that had happened, I understood that the one who was truly panicking wasn't me. I replied directly, without flinching. No. What I did tonight was refuse to be used anymore. My answer was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Michael took a step toward me, but before he could say more, Jessica burst into loud, theatrical sobs from behind him. Her voice was no longer sharp as it had been at the party, but soft and wavering. The softer it was, the more it highlighted her pathetic helplessness. Your family, and you wouldn't even help. You just stood there and let Mom be humiliated. I turned to look at her. Her tears no longer affected me. I said one short sentence, each word cutting. Help is voluntary. What you wanted was a bailout. Jessica was speechless. She was still crying, but she couldn't argue, because she knew I was right. The tension in the living room deepened. My mother-in-law had been sitting silently on the sofa since we got home, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. I thought she would side with her children as she always did, that she would find a way to blame me, but she didn't. She sat there for a long time, so long I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Finally she spoke, her voice low and gravelly, stripped of its usual, sharp, commanding tone. Each word seemed to carry an immense weight. That's enough. This happened because Jessica went too far. The room fell silent. Michael stared at his mother as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jessica's head snapped up, her mouth agape, and I, despite having prepared myself for many possibilities, had not expected that. It wasn't a complete transformation on my mother-in-law's part, not a full awakening, but it was the first crack, the first time she hadn't unconditionally defended her daughter, and in that moment, I knew something else. The conflict in this house was no longer just about a party bill, because with my mother-in-law's allegiance starting to shift, Michael and Jessica would only turn on me more fiercely. My mother-in-law's words had barely settled when Michael erupted. He spun from his mother to me, his face crimson with fury, and pointed a trembling finger in my face. You have completely disgraced this family today. His voice echoed off the walls of the living room, sharp and accusatory. I stood my ground. After the party, I knew there was no going back to the old way of keeping the peace. The peace my in-laws wanted was simply my silence and my open wallet. Jessica, emboldened by her brother's outburst, chimed in. She collapsed onto the sofa, crying dramatically while still managing to sling accusations at me. If you had just paid the bill first, everything would have been fine. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. Seeing me made into a laughingstock must make you very happy, right? I listened, my heart turning to ice. That tactic, crying while attacking, I had seen it from her countless times. Whenever she was wrong, she cried. Whenever she was exposed, she acted as if the whole world was against her. But that night, I had zero patience left for her fake victimhood. I looked her straight in the eye and said slowly, "The person who humiliated you wasn't me. It was your own mouth, writing checks your bank account couldn't cash." The words hit their mark. Jessica shot up, her eyes blazing, her face flushed, looking as if she was about to lunge at me. But before she could move, Michael stepped in front of her. He didn't turn to ask his sister if she was right or wrong, nor did he acknowledge his own role in the fiasco. He just stared at me, his voice dripping with blame. "You are my wife. If you can't support your own family, you could at least not kick us when we're down in front of everyone. Do you have any respect for me at all?" I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Using our marriage as a shield to demand I pay his sister's debts, that he could still say that with a straight face was astonishingly shameless. I looked right at him, my gaze unwavering. "I am your wife, Michael. Not an ATM for your entire family to make withdrawals from." This time, even my mother-in-law couldn't stay silent. She pushed herself up from the sofa, her voice rising, though it lacked its usual steel. It sounded more like exasperated confusion. "For heaven's sake. It was my birthday party. You couldn't just put aside a few dollars to avoid all this drama? All the guests are gone. And here you are, still fighting. Do you think this is worth it?" I turned to her. In the past, I might have chosen silence. But that night, I saw clearly that my silence only fed their irrationality. I replied firmly. "If it was just a few dollars, Why didn't you tell your daughter to pay it herself? The room fell silent again. My question, though not shouted, was like a stone thrown into a tense, still pond. My mother-in-law froze, her gaze shifting from me to Jessica. It was no longer a look of absolute protection, but one of questioning, suspicion, and exhaustion. I knew a crack had formed in her certainty. Seeing his mother waver, Michael grew more desperate. He stepped right in front of me, his voice suddenly becoming deceptively calm, as if he were patiently reasoning with a difficult wife. All right, fine. What's done is done. Just transfer me the $42,000. Consider it a loan to the family. Jess and I will pay you back when we can. We're family, Kate. Why do you have to be so difficult? I stared at my husband for a few seconds, and then I laughed out loud. It wasn't a happy laugh, but a bitter, hollow sound that tasted like ash in my throat. Aren't you ashamed to even say that? I asked. When you need to drain my account, we're family. When I need your respect, where are you? Before Michael could respond, I opened my phone, pulled up my banking app, and placed it on the coffee table in front of everyone. The living room light illuminated the screen. I tapped it lightly with my finger, my voice flat. The joint account? I locked your transfer privileges this afternoon. Don't think I'm stupid enough to let you corner me at the party and then come home to empty my accounts. This time, Michael's face truly paled. I saw his jaw tighten, a flicker of panic in his eyes. It was just a flicker, but it was enough. I knew he had, in fact, planned to pressure me into transferring the money once we got home. Whether through coaxing, yelling, or using his mother as leverage, the end goal was the same. My money. Seeing her brother's plan foiled, Jessica changed her tune again. The tears stopped. She dropped her hands from her face and glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. You're so calculating. You planned this all along, didn't you? You wanted to smear mud all over my mother's face. You waited for this exact day to humiliate my family. I took one step toward her. Not fast, not aggressive, but it was enough to make her instinctively take half a step back. I looked right at her and said slowly, each word deliberate, no. I prepared so I wouldn't be stepped on by people like you ever again. Just as I finished speaking, we heard the screech of tires outside, followed by heavy, running footsteps on the driveway. Before anyone could react, someone started pounding on the front door, the force of the blows making the whole frame shudder. A man's rough voice, dripping with menace, yelled through the door, "Jessica, open up! The payment is due. Don't play dead in there." The entire family froze. The blood drained from Jessica's face. Michael rushed to the window, yanking the curtains shut as if not seeing the men would make them disappear. My mother-in-law slowly turned her head toward her daughter, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. And I, standing in the middle of that living room, knew one thing with absolute certainty. What happened at the country club was just the opening act. The real storm was just beginning. The pounding on the door continued, relentless, as if the men outside were determined to break it down. Michael stood by the window, his back pressed against the wall, while Jessica was frozen in the middle of the room, her face a mask of pure terror. That look of abject fear was all my mother-in-law needed to see to know this wasn't a mistake. Outside, a man's voice bellowed again, louder this time, laced with a crude, thuggish tone. "Open this door. Don't hide. That $10,000 was just the down payment. If we don't get a resolution tonight, we'll be sitting on your lawn tomorrow for the whole neighborhood to see." Hearing this, my mother-in-law's hands, which were clutching the arms of her chair, began to tremble violently. She turned to her daughter, her voice cracking. "Who did you borrow from? How much?" Jessica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at her brother, her eyes pleading for help. Michael immediately jumped in, with the frantic energy of someone trying to suppress a devastating truth. "It's just a few thousand, Mom. I'll handle it. Don't worry." But he had barely finished his sentence when one of the men outside let out a coarse laugh and shouted, deliberately loud enough for the neighbors to hear, A few thousand? The principal and interest bring it to 60,000 now. And we've got the loan agreement, co-signed by a family member as guarantor. You think you can run? That number 60,000 hit the room like a physical blow. My mother-in-law collapsed back into her chair. She didn't faint, but the way she crumpled was almost worse. Her eyes were wide, darting between her son and daughter as if she couldn't process what she had just heard. Her lips trembled for several seconds before she managed to form a question. Was this my birthday party? Or was it a trap you two set to ruin this entire family? I stood silently, not intervening yet. There are moments when people need to hear the sound of their own world shattering before they can truly wake up. What chilled me most at that moment wasn't the $60,000 figure, but the look on Michael's face. His panic wasn't that of an innocent bystander. It was the panic of a co-conspirator whose cover was about to be blown. The sweat on his forehead, the way his eyes darted from the door to the living room, it all screamed one thing. He knew about this all along. Cornered, Jessica finally broke. She shrieked, a raw sound of tears and desperation. I did it for you, Mom. You were the one complaining day and night about how everyone else gets grand parties and you didn't want to be outdone. I was just trying to make you happy. You think this was easy for me? Her words were like a slap to my mother-in-law's pride. For years, Eleanor had justified her actions under the guise of, for the family's reputation. But she had never imagined that one day, her own daughter would use those very complaints to excuse taking out a loan from a shark. Eleanor sat stunned, her face ashen. I looked at her, then at Jessica. Now was the time. One well-placed question would bring everything to light. I spoke, my voice so calm it felt foreign even to me. So, the loan agreement. Jessica fell silent instantly. Michael said nothing. That silence was more terrifying than all the shouting from outside. Hearing my question, my mother-in-law looked as if she were suffocating. She turned to her children, her voice a hoarse whisper. What did you use of mine? Outside, one of the men heard her and chuckled, his voice full of the smug confidence of someone holding all the cards. What else? A copy of her Social Security card, her pension statements, and her signature as a guarantor. Without your mom's documents, you think your daughter could borrow on good faith alone? My mother-in-law looked as if she'd been electrocuted. She shot up from her chair, her knees so weak they almost buckled. She pointed a trembling finger at Jessica. You dared to take my personal documents to a loan shark? Jessica, truly panicking now, rushed toward her mother, tears and snot streaming down her face as she tried to defend herself. I was just going to borrow it temporarily. I thought after Kate paid for the party, I could pay it all back immediately. I never meant to hurt you, Mom. That last sentence hung in the air, freezing the room. Even I, who had suspected so much, felt a cold dread creep up. She really had planned for me to pay for everything. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was the naked, ugly truth. In that instant, my mother-in-law raised her hand. Crack! The sound of her palm hitting Jessica's cheek was sharp and dry, so loud it made me flinch. Jessica staggered, clutching her face, her eyes wide with disbelief. Michael froze, taking a half step forward before stopping. My mother-in-law was breathing heavily, her perfect hairdo now disheveled, her eyes red. The elegant hostess from the party was gone. She pointed a finger at both of her children, her voice breaking with despair, each word a self-inflicted wound. You didn't throw me a party. You put me up for sale for the sake of your own vanity. The room seemed to explode with the weight of her words, yet no one responded. There was nothing left to argue. Outside, the pounding on the door continued. Inside, my mother-in-law was trembling, betrayed by the very children she had spoiled, and I, watching it all unfold, felt no satisfaction. I only saw one thing clearly. From that moment on, my mother-in-law was finally, truly awake. Not because of what I said, not because she lost face with her friends, but because she had seen with her own eyes that the two children she cherished most were willing to pawn her identity and her honor just to patch up their fragile egos. My mother-in-law's accusation had barely faded when the pounding on the front door resumed, even more violently than before. The metal of the security door groaned under the assault. One of the men yelled, "Open this door! You can hide tonight. But you can't hide forever. You don't pay. We sit right here and tell the whole damn street your business." That was when Michael truly started to panic. He whipped around to me, his voice lowered but his eyes commanding. "Kate, what are you doing? Don't you dare call the police. If this gets out, this family is finished." I could only laugh a cold, bitter sound. Even now, his fear wasn't for his mother whose identity had been stolen, nor for his sister entangled with loan sharks. His only fear was that, if this gets out, this family is finished. I looked him straight in the eye and said, slowly and clearly, "This family was finished the moment you helped your sister take your mother's documents to a loan shark." Michael started to argue, but I gave him no chance. I picked up my phone, right in front of everyone, and dialed 911. The moment Jessica saw the phone to my ear, she lunged at me, trying to snatch it away. I sidestepped her easily, taking a half step back. My eyes locked on hers. "Touch me again, and I'll add assault to the list." The threat stopped her cold. For the first time, Jessica seemed to realize I was no longer the sister-in-law who would just take it. She stood frozen, her hands trembling, unable to move closer. I spoke clearly to the dispatcher, giving our address, reporting a disturbance, and mentioning that there was evidence of identity theft and loan fraud. My voice was steady, my words precise. The calmer I became, the more surreal it felt. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived. Seeing the squad car pull up, the 2 men outside immediately lost their aggressive posture, though they still tried to maintain a swagger. One of them pulled a sheaf of papers from his pocket and said loudly, "We're just here to collect on a legitimate debt, officer. No disturbance here." I walked out onto the porch, into the middle of the scene. The air still faintly smelled of the catered food from the party. Under the harsh white porch light, every face was starkly visible. I pointed to the papers in the man's hand and said to the officer, "This loan was likely secured using forged documents without the guarantor's consent. I'd like you to investigate this matter thoroughly." The officers took the documents and began to examine them. I stood by, not interfering. My mother-in-law had followed me outside. She stood just behind me, her arms wrapped around herself, her face deathly pale. When an officer asked who the guarantor was, she answered in a trembling voice, "That's me. But I never signed that. I didn't know anything about it." An officer held up the paper, comparing the signature on the loan document to the one on Eleanor's driver's license. The signature on the loan was a clumsy, awkward scrawl, completely different from the neat, practiced signature on her ID. The forgery was obvious. My mother-in-law stared at the paper, and tears began to stream down her face. She wasn't sobbing, just gasping for breath. Her voice choked. "I didn't sign it. I swear I didn't." My documents were in my desk drawer. It was then that Jessica completely lost control. She turned to her brother as if he were her last hope. Her voice shrill. "Mike, tell them. You were the one who said to just sign Mom's name for now, that we'd pay it back and it would be fine." The words hung in the air. Michael's face turned a sickly shade of green. He lunged as if to silence her, but it was too late. The entire yard fell silent. At that moment, this was no longer a family squabble. It was a criminal conspiracy, a plot to use their own mother's identity to secure a fraudulent loan. An officer turned to Michael. "Sir, your name was mentioned. How do you explain this?" Sweat beaded on Michael's forehead. He stammered, I didn't." He couldn't form a coherent sentence. His smooth, confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by the terrified face of a man caught in the spotlight. I didn't miss my chance. I took out my phone, played the recording I had made the other night, and held it out for the officer to hear. In the breathless silence of the yard, Michael's voice came through, clear as day. "Just get through the party. When the bill comes, if you're short, I'll talk to Kate. Then, I pulled up a screenshot of a text message I had saved and showed it to everyone. The text from Michael to Jessica read, "If you can't get it, just use Mom's papers to get it done." My mother-in-law stared at my phone screen, then slowly turned to her son. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were no longer weak. They were filled with a painful, cold clarity. She spoke, biting off each word. "I brought you into this world, I raised you, just so you could use me as a shield to commit fraud." Michael hung his head, unable to look his mother in the eye. Jessica stood beside him, her legs looking like they were about to give out. The two lenders, realizing they were now entangled in a criminal investigation, changed their tune completely. They started saying they just wanted their money back, that they had no interest in getting involved in a forgery case. The police instructed everyone involved to come to the station the next day to give formal statements. They warned the lenders not to cause any more disturbances, but by then, it was far too late to salvage any semblance of dignity. Neighbors were gathered on their lawns and peeking through their blinds, whispering to each other. The public image, the social standing my mother-in-law had spent a lifetime cultivating, had been shattered into a million pieces right before her eyes. As one of the officers handed Michael a summons, he turned and glared at me. His eyes were no longer just angry, they were filled with a deep, venomous resentment. He snarled, "You happy now? You wanted to tear this family apart, and you've done it." I looked directly into his eyes, not blinking, not flinching. And in that moment, I no longer saw the man I married. I saw a coward who had chosen to sacrifice both his mother and his wife to save himself. I replied, my voice steady and quiet. "This family tore itself apart the moment you decided to use your mother and me as human shields." The meeting at the police station the next day dragged on until almost noon. When I finally walked out into the harsh sunlight, I felt a profound chill. In less than 24 hours, the family I had once tried so hard to keep together had ripped itself to shreds in front of my eyes, exposing the rot of greed, betrayal, and the willingness to use loved ones as collateral. On the drive home, Michael didn't say a word. Jessica sat in the back, her face puffy and tear-streaked. My mother-in-law was unnervingly still, her hands in her lap, staring straight ahead like a survivor of a shipwreck still in shock. I thought that when we got home, there would at least be a period of stunned silence. I was wrong. The moment he walked through the door, Michael kicked off his shoes and sent them flying into a corner. He spun around to face me, his expression no longer flustered as it had been at the station. It had hardened into the cold, resentful glare of a man who had been cornered and had decided to stop pretending, he said, his voice flat and sharp as a shard of glass. "Since it's come to this, let's get a divorce. I'm not living with a woman who would humiliate her own husband in public." I wasn't surprised. From the moment he had looked at me with such hatred in the yard the night before, I knew this was coming. I just hadn't expected that after he abetted his sister in identity theft, after being questioned by the police, he would still have the audacity to cast himself as the victim. Before I could reply, Jessica chimed in, as if on cue. She slumped onto the sofa, her voice dripping with vitriol. "That's right, Mike. A sister-in-law like her just wants to drag her family through the mud. I knew from the beginning she was no good. She acts all proper, but she's nothing but a cold, calculating schemer." "Shut your mouth," my mother-in-law's voice cut through the air. The command was so sharp it startled even me. It wasn't her usual scolding. It was a roar of genuine fury and shame. She pointed a finger at her daughter, her eyes red. "Do you have any idea how much humiliation you've caused? Is this not enough for you?" Jessica froze, her lips trembling. But she didn't dare say another word. I watched the scene, realizing that for the first time in years, my mother-in-law was unequivocally on my side. But that very shift seemed to enrage Michael even more. He stepped into the center of the room, his voice rising. "A divorce means we split everything down the middle. I have a stake in the assets in this house. Don't think you can cause a huge scene and then kick me out with nothing." I stared at my husband for a moment. Then, without a word, walked into my small home office. I opened a drawer and took out a file I had prepared some time ago, not because I had been planning a divorce, but because living with someone like Michael had taught me that when you need to protect yourself, words are never enough. I returned to the living room, placed the file on the coffee table, and slid it toward him. On top was a printout of our joint account statement. Beneath it was a detailed history of the irregular withdrawals he had made over the past several months, most of which I had traced directly to Jessica's account. The next section was a reconciliation of our savings, highlighting the missing funds, the cash withdrawals with no explanation, and a copy of the request I had submitted to the bank the previous afternoon to freeze all suspicious activity. I looked at Michael, my voice as flat as the table between us. Don't forget that the down payment for this condo came from my premarital assets, the furniture, our joint savings. The money that's gone missing from the account, I have accounted for every single dollar. Not only do you not have a claim to more, you will have to explain the funds you took without my knowledge. Michael grabbed the papers, flipping through them. His hand froze when he reached the page, detailing the transfers to his sister's account. His aggressive demeanor faltered. For the first time, he seemed to understand that I was no longer the wife who would just grit her teeth and hope things would resolve themselves. But I wasn't finished. I opened my phone, pulled up a saved email, and placed it on the table in front of him. And then there's this. A copy of the email you sent to a credit officer, using our joint status to apply for a credit line increase without my consent. If you'd like, I can forward this to both the bank and your company's HR department. That was all it took. The color drained from Michael's face. I knew he understood the danger. Once this was no longer a private family matter, the consequences would be far more severe than just an argument or loss of face. It would affect his job, his credit score, and the professional reputation he had worked so hard to maintain. My mother-in-law, who had been sitting in stunned silence, looked as if she were suffocating. I turned to her. The face of the sharp-tongued, critical woman I had known for years seemed to have vanished, replaced by the weary, defeated expression of a mother who had just realized her son wasn't just foolishly loyal to his sister, but was also secretly treating his wife's finances as his own personal piggy bank. Pushed to the absolute limit, Michael slammed his hand on the table, rattling the teacups. He roared, his last shred of composure gone. Fine. I was trying to get money from you. So what? You have money, but you won't help the family. What's the point of hoarding it? You live in this house, you eat this family's food, and when we're in trouble, you just stand by and watch. Are you even human? The room fell silent. Perhaps even he was shocked at the words that had come out of his mouth. But once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. And this time, the person who looked suffocated wasn't me. It was my mother-in-law. She slowly stood up, her hands trembling, and looked at her son as if he were a stranger. Then, she raised her hand. Crack! The slap was so hard it snapped Michael's head to the side. I was stunned. Jessica's jaw dropped. Michael clutched his cheek, glaring at his mother, clearly in disbelief that she would strike him in front of me. My mother-in-law was breathing heavily, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. Have you no shame? She is your wife, not a bank for you and your sister to plunder. The room was utterly silent. No one said another word. I stood there, watching, feeling a profound coldness settle over me. No joy, no satisfaction, just cold, because in that moment, something inside me finally died. It wasn't just my trust in Michael. It was the last, frayed thread of our marriage that I had been trying to hold on to. I looked at him, my voice quiet but final. You want a divorce. You'll get it. But every single dollar you took from me, you will pay back. In the days that followed, everything unraveled faster than I could have imagined. There was no energy left for deception or delay. Jessica's loan became an official legal matter. The documents were scrutinized, the signature was analyzed, and she was ultimately forced to sign a repayment agreement. With no other options, she began selling off the symbols of her former pride, her designer handbags, some jewelry, and the new scooter she had just bought. The very things she had used to show off were now being liquidated to pay off her debts. As for Michael, the consequences weren't confined to our home. His company got wind of the fact that he had fraudulently used my name on a credit application. Disciplinary action was swift. The team lead position he was so proud of was stripped from him. The man who had always spoken so loudly and cared so much about his image began to avoid eye contact with his colleagues, ducking the very conversations he used to relish. I filed for divorce. There were no more dramatic scenes. I had a lawyer, and everything was handled cleanly and professionally. When we finally sat across from each other to sign the papers, I said quietly, "I'm not coming back." For the first time, I saw Michael truly flinch. His expression wasn't one of anger or resentment, but something closer to panic. But it was far too late. My mother-in-law changed the most. After that day, she called a few close relatives, not to make excuses, but to set the record straight. She stopped bragging, stopped trying to shift blame. She admitted her own vanity, her blind faith in her daughter, and her unfair treatment of me over the years. I watched her from a distance, not interrupting. It was the first time I had ever seen her truly humble herself, not because she had lost to someone else, but because she recognized her own faults. One afternoon, she came to see me. She wasn't wearing a fancy dress or speaking in her usual sharp tone. She just brought a small bag of fruit. She sat for a long time, her hands twisting in her lap, struggling to find the words. Finally, she said softly, "Catherine, I am so sorry. I always thought you were cold and calculating. Now I see that the greedy and toxic ones were not you." I didn't reply right away. I didn't hug her or cry. I just sat and listened. Some apologies come late, but they still need to be spoken, and some wounds are too deep to be healed by a single apology. I looked at her and said slowly, "I wasn't trying to get revenge, Eleanor. I just refused to continue living in a house where my decency was treated as an obligation." She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking slightly, but she didn't cry out loud. I knew her pain was no longer about losing face in public. It was about the dawning realization of how she had treated the person who had been right there, in her own home. All along, Jessica lost almost everything. The man she had been dating broke things off as soon as he heard the story. The praise and admiration she had so desperately chased turned into whispers and gossip behind her back. The one thing she valued most, her image, had become the source of her greatest pain. Michael tried to meet with me a few times, no longer shouting, no longer posturing. He said he just wanted to talk things over, amicably. But I had nothing left to say. I just looked at him and asked one final question. "When you and your sister were planning to have me pay that bill, were you thinking about being amicable with me?" He fell silent. And in that silence, we both knew there was nothing left to save. In the end, my mother-in-law moved out to stay with a cousin for a while. Before she left, she gave the house keys to Michael. Her voice was weary but firm. "I still have my house, but you two have lost all of your dignity and character." She was no longer protecting them. And sometimes, it is the removal of that protection that forces people to finally face themselves. As for me, I left that marriage. It wasn't painless, but I had no regrets. Some losses are painful, but holding on would have been even more so. After everything, I came to understand one simple truth. You can be short on money, but you should never be short on self-respect. Because when a family builds its foundation on vanity and greed, it is only a matter of time before it burns itself down from the inside.